Hey everybody, this is Darren Van Dam, and you are watching Flick Connection, the show that connects you with the best movies to stream. And today we're going to be talking about the new Hulu original movie Prey, plus 9 other movies like it that are well worth watching on Hulu. So, Prey is the new Predator movie. It's technically Predator 5, and it's a Hulu original, and it is ranked on this list higher than you would probably expect. I'm going to talk about it, as well as 9 other movies that are a mix of action and horror, all movies that go in line with the Predator franchise. But we're going to kick this list off with a lesser-known sci-fi flick from just a few years ago called Prospect. While this movie does take place on an alien planet, the structure of the story is much more akin to an old-fashioned Western. An ore miner and his daughter cross paths with a couple of bandits, again on this alien planet, and it's a beautiful setting, especially for such a low-budget movie. And while Pedro Pascal's character is not the lead character, he really does carry it and make this movie work quite well. This movie does have somewhat of a slow pace to it, and while there are plenty of dangers on this alien planet, there's no big monsters or anything like that. It is not that type of movie. As I said, it does feel kind of like an old-fashioned Western. Even the weapon that they use in this movie is more akin to a musket than it is any sort of like sci-fi laser blaster. Ultimately though, Prospect is a really well-composed movie. It's glued together well, it's interesting, it's got a lot going for it, but keep in mind, it is my number 10 pick on this list. My next pick is only a few years old, and it actually comes from Russia. It is Russian language, you will have to read subtitles for this one, and it is the most like a horror movie out of everything on this list. It's titled Sputnik. It's fair to say this movie also has quite a bit in common with Alien. After an incident in space, a Russian cosmonaut returns home to discover that something is hiding inside of him. And most of the movie takes place inside a secure facility. This is a fairly slow burn, and it is not much of a jump out of your skin horror movie as much as it is just an interesting story and a different concept sort of coming to life in this movie. It does have some great moments in it, but be prepared for a slow burn, and again, don't expect it to be a terrifying movie, but it fits squarely in the horror genre, and I think by the time you get to the end, you will understand why I included it on this Predator list. Now, my next pick on this list admittedly has the least to do with the Predator franchise, but it is still a fantastic man versus nature movie. In the Heart of the Sea is supposedly the more true story behind Moby Dick, or at least some of the events that inspired Moby Dick. And obviously this movie takes its own liberties, so it's in kind of a gray area, but it does have some fantastic visuals in it. This movie was expertly directed by Ron Howard. This is also one of the better Chris Hemsworth movies outside of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. His movies can be hit and miss, but this is one that I really enjoyed because it does tell the man versus nature story incredibly well. My next pick is another man versus nature style of a story, but this one goes into heavy fantasy territory and stars Christian Bale, Gerard Butler, and Matthew McConaughey all teaming up to fight fire-breathing dragons. That's right. Yes, Reign of Fire I consider to be a criminally underrated movie, but at the same time, I will admit that I wish it were better than it were. That said though, this is still an exceptional PG-13 action movie. It's a little neutered from the PG-13 rating, and they never quite explore this idea of a post-apocalyptic world ruled by dragons very well. At least they don't flesh it out as much as you would like. The story actually stays fairly small, meaning I would have loved to see sequels to this movie. However, it was a bit of a flop at the box office. That said though, for something you can check out on Hulu right now, this is a really badass flick. Okay, so Predator 2 starring Danny Glover is included on Hulu, however it doesn't make the list. At the same time, I will say I think that's kind of a misunderstood movie, and I do think it's quite a bit better than people give it credit for. That said though, the original Predator came out in 1987, Predator 2 came out in 1990, and my next pick came out in about the same era, the early 90s, when action movies were still rated R and really cool. Demolition Man.
We're police officers. We're not trained to handle this kind of violence.
This is a cult classic Stallone movie starring Wesley Snipes and one of my favorite characters he's ever done, and I am a big Wesley Snipes fan. Snipes plays this ultra-violent criminal who has been frozen for years and then gets turned loose on this extremely non-violent future, and that's where a lot of the comedy comes into play. Stallone and Snipes are both taken out of this like deep freeze, and they wake up in this bizarre future where Sandra Bullock is a cop, Rob Schneider is in the mix, Dennis Leary's leading a revolution in the sewers, every restaurant in the future is Taco Bell. I mean, there's really bizarre stuff, and there's a reason this movie has continued to be a cult classic. It's got so many fun moments in it. It's by far the least serious movie on this list, but that's also why I have it ranked so high.
He doesn't know how to use the 3 seashells.
Okay, I know not everyone will agree with my next placement, but I know some of you will agree that Predators is actually a pretty decent sequel, or reboot, or whatever you want to call it.
We're being hunted.
What?
This planet is a game preserve. We're the game.
Released in 2010, this movie was produced by Robert Rodriguez, one of my favorite directors, and while the movie itself doesn't have the flavor of Rodriguez movies, it is filled to the brim with action and is a pretty tight story as well. There is a development with Lawrence Fishburne that I didn't think elevated the movie too much, and of course, second to the original Predator, out of the entire franchise, keep in mind there's over 5 movies in this franchise, I think Predators actually has one of the best casts. Obviously because of Lawrence Fishburne, but Topher Grace is pretty good in it, Alice Braga, but you've also got Danny Trejo and Walton Goggins in this movie. Then of course Adrian Brody, who I would have never expected to work in this movie, and he somehow does. And in retrospect, I'll admit he was a pretty good choice. The wrong thing to do would try to fill the shoes of Schwarzenegger with somebody, because that was never gonna work. Going in the opposite direction with an Adrian Brody type actually makes sense, and ultimately because he is such a good actor, he made this movie work. I mean, it is a mindless action movie, but it's also really entertaining. Another mindless action movie that's really entertaining that was a massive hit back when it was released is Independence Day. Now, something to note about Independence Day is this movie is not nearly as cool as it seemed to be back when it was released. This has turned into kind of a cheesy sci-fi movie. Don't let that hurt your feelings if you used to love it and think it was awesome. I did too. If you watch it today though, some of the effects don't quite hold up. I mean, you'll actually be surprised at how awful some of the effects look. Not all of them, but some of them. However, that adds a unique charm to this movie and makes it this big, overblown, blockbuster movie that is essentially just a cheesy sci-fi movie that probably deserves to be on riff tracks or something. And I love that contrast in this movie. Again, if it's been a while since you've seen it, consider rewatching it, but rewatch it with the mindset that this is a cheesy alien movie.
In the words of my generation, up yours!
Alright, some of you were wondering when Prey was going to get added on the list, and here it is. This is the spot where I have ranked it. This movie was just released on Friday, and if you saw the trailers leading up, it was kind of a mixed bag. It looked like it could be pretty good, but it also looked like they could blow it. However, this was directed by Dan Trachtenberg, who's most famous for doing 10 Cloverfield Lane, but he also directed several episodes of The Boys and Black Mirror. So he's got some street cred to start with, and I'll admit the concept of placing this 300 years ago in the Comanche Nation is a really interesting idea. But it's also a female-led action movie, which does not always work, and it's usually because that's the only idea there. Isn't it cool that this chick is so badass? You've got to have more substance than that. That is not an interesting enough idea. And Prey actually does this right. I mean, it is a Predator movie. It's got some mindless moments in it, but the motivations of the main character are very clear and they actually do make sense. They make it very clear that it's extremely unusual for a woman to be a warrior, and they don't dwell on it too long. It just functions pretty well in this story for multiple reasons. And that's ultimately what worked about Prey for me, was the story worked incredibly well. There were genuinely jaw-dropping moments in this movie, which is not typically the case with straight-to-streaming movies. Oftentimes, especially with ones that are attached to properties like this, they're not very good. That's why they go to a streaming service and not the theater. But after that last Predator movie, the word Predator is now
box office poison.
Which is probably why this movie's called Prey and doesn't have Predator in the name. But you can tell there was a lot of care into crafting this story. It's actually got a really tight narrative, again, especially for a straight-to-streaming movie. I mean, I have this ranked above Predators, which is a movie that I like. This is a solid sequel to Predator, and they've even set it up to potentially have a sequel itself, which I would absolutely watch. I thoroughly enjoyed this movie, if you can't tell already, by its number 3 placement on a list of bangers. Alright, my next pick doesn't quite fit in with the Predator universe, not as much as a lot of the movies on this list, but still, I think Spider-Man 2 is one of the best action movies in its genre.
Where is she? Oh, she'll be just fine. Let's talk.
There are far too many superhero movies and shows nowadays to even possibly consider counting them. I'll say though, Spider-Man 2 continues to hold up as one of the greats. Hulu does have the entire original trilogy available. It's also available on Netflix right now, and I feel like Spider-Man 2 has been somewhat forgotten with time, but it's got some of the best action in the franchise in it. And Alfred Molina as Doc Ock is not only an incredible performance, but the costume and the effects are all great. Unlike Independence Day, most of the effects in Spider-Man 2 still hold up today, and it fits right in with the current movies. I mean, the Tom Holland ones are good. I like those movies, but the first 2 Spider-Man movies, I think, are still some of the best in the franchise. And then before my number 1 pick, I will say some other action movies that I kind of wanted to include, but they just don't have anything to do with Predator, are American Assassin and Ninja Assassin. Those are both excellent, surprisingly bloody action movies that are, I think, much better than people give them credit for. Those are both included with Hulu right now if you need some extra action recommendations. But some of you may have already guessed, my number 1 pick on this list is the original 1987 Predator.
There's something out there waiting for us. And it ain't no man.
Now, I'll start by saying I think a lot of people don't realize this is directed by John McTiernan, and I know that's not a household name, even though it should be. He is also known for directing Die Hard, Die Hard with a Vengeance, and Arnold Schwarzenegger again in The Last Action Hero. He is literally one of the greatest action movie directors of all time. He practically invented the way that we make action movies today. Yeah, action movies had been done before, but not quite like Predator. Not only that, this is an incredibly tight story with very little fat on it, and there's quite a bit of action leading up to the introduction of the Predator, which doesn't really happen till about halfway through this movie, yet it is not dull for a moment. And Schwarzenegger was a big star at the time, but this somehow made him even bigger. Carl Weathers is fantastic in this movie, Bill Duke, Sonny Landham, another former governor with Jesse Ventura, and then Kevin Peter Hall actually plays the Predator, who interestingly was also Harry in Harry and the Hendersons, which came out the same year as Predator. Unlike some of the other movies I mentioned, most of the effects in Predator still hold up, and it's got some incredible cinematography in it. Not all the way through, but there are some fantastic shots, and again, the pacing of this movie just doesn't quit until it's over, and it is highly rewatchable. I promise you, if it's been a while since you've seen it, Predator not only holds up, it is still, to this day, so much better than a lot of things made in this genre, because so much of what you're seeing on screen is authentic. It's real stunts, real costumes, nothing is really faked except for the invisibility, and that still to this day looks really wicked. So that is the list. Hopefully you found some great movies to watch on Hulu. It is not a streaming service I check out very often, but there are always some gems there. If you're new to the channel, be sure to click the subscribe button and the little bell icon. That way you get notified about these videos and you can catch the movies before they disappear from their respective streaming service. But I will keep making these videos as long as you keep watching them. Thanks for checking out this special Predator episode, and you will see me on the next one.